Faith is the victory we know that overcomes the world.
Good evening. Purity has always been a battlefield, and it is not one that can be defended on accident. No one can just accidentally drift into holiness. Not a single man or woman has ever stumbled into righteousness just by sheer momentum. And that's because the real conflict is not the things that are around us. The real conflict is what is within us. And so Jesus moves in our last section from the sixth commandment to the seventh commandment in this next section here. And he isn't just going to tell us what the law says. Just like previously, he is going to tell us what the law means as well. He isn't just talking about scandal here. He's talking about inward corruption. So he's not softening the law either. And that was a problem. And that was why he wanted to get that out of the way earlier in this sermon. He wanted to show that he was not attempting to soften the law. Instead, he is sharpening it. He's telling us that purity is not won by just avoiding scandal. Purity is won by waging war on the heart. And so he's going to expose that hidden war and call us to fight it with seriousness, because the stakes of that war are indeed serious and they are eternal. First, starting off the letter of the law, verse 27. Ye have heard that it was said, Thou shalt not commit adultery. So God's law defines purity for us. Now, our world tries its very hardest to blur those lines, to kind of make it seem like, well, maybe it's just morally gray. Maybe it's not black and white. But God does not leave his holiness undefined. And the Pirates of the Caribbean movie, one of the characters is yelling at the villain about following the pirate code. And the villain looks at her and says, well, we've always looked at those as more of just guidelines. And that's how a lot of people look at the Bible. That's how a lot of people look at purity. It's just guidelines. It's just, generally, we kind of follow them. If it suits us, we follow it. If it suits us, we stay holy. But when it doesn't, when we don't like that, then we just veer off, because it's just guidelines. They don't view it as strictly necessary. But Solomon wrote about that very idea in Proverbs 14 and verse 12. He said, There is a way which seemeth right unto man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Right? That's the end of that kind of thinking, of viewing this as just a guideline. God has always drawn very clear moral lines. Christ made it very clear that God's law is not just a suggestion. It's not just a negotiable guideline. It is a divine boundary. It is fixed, it is objective, and it is unchanging. We noted last week that God doesn't use pointless additional words when outlining his law, when trying to define his law. He doesn't leave you guessing about what is right and wrong. He explains it in terms where a child could understand. He makes it clear and simple. The law is enlightening, according to Psalm 19 and verse 8. It's not something that's going to obscure or confuse you. It's not vague. It is enlightening. It is clear. It clarifies the truth for people. It lights the path so that no one is left wondering where the boundary line is. Where is the path? Did I step off back there? Well, the path is well lit. Psalm 119, 105. God's moral boundary is the line that he has drawn in the dirt isn't hidden. It's not obscured by shadows. He isn't watching us groping in the darkness, knowing where the line is, but watching us unable to see it and laughing when we fall short. He has lit it up so brightly that it is impossible for us to miss where the line is, and it breaks his heart when we choose to cross it anyways. While the world's moral standard shifts, God never does. When God draws a line, it remains exactly where he drew it. So then we have this command here against adultery. And that teaches several things about God's clarity. God is the one who defines sin, not society. Adultery was accepted in many of the cultures around Israel. It's accepted in many cultures today as well. But it doesn't matter where it's accepted because that's never altered God's command. Paul wrote in Romans 7:7, "I had not known sin except through the law." Without God's revealed boundary line, man invents his own, but the line that man invents is constantly moving. Jesus always points back to God's line. God defines marriage, and thus he also defines the violations of that marriage. And we'll talk significantly more about this in a couple of weeks when we get there. But Jesus is consistent with Genesis. One man and one woman for life. Genesis 2:24 and Matthew 19:4-6. God is the one who instituted marriage. He is the one who defined the covenant. And thus, if he's the one who defined the covenant, he defines what breaks that covenant. He is the one who gets to draw the line. And we don't get to change that. God's law protects the misguided, and it guards the innocent. God's commandments aren't chains. They're shields. I think too often the world tries to impress upon us this idea that the law of the Lord, when we're reading our Bibles, and there are things that we are to do and things that we are to not do, that is restrictive. That is just not freedom. But God's not trying to imprison us. He hasn't erected these walls to be a prison around us. He has done so to protect us. It was never meant to restrict our joy. It was meant to preserve it. The world will mock God's laws as outdated, as oppressive. But that's not what they really are. God gives commands because he loves his creation. Every "thou shalt not" is an effort to guard his creation from something, whether that be heartbreak or betrayal or ruin or self-destruction. So why does God forbid adultery? Because adultery destroys the innocent. At its core, the seventh commandment reveals not only the sanctity of the marriage bond, but also God's protection of those who would be harmed if it were violated. Adultery destroys the lives of those who are involved in it, who participate in it. Solomon wrote in Proverbs 6, beginning in verse 32, "He that committeth adultery with a woman is void of understanding. He doeth it who would destroy his own soul. Wounds and dishonor shall he get, and his reproach shall be wiped away." He ruins himself. It's self-destruction. He's tearing himself apart. He wounds the very core of who he is. The world sells adultery as something pleasurable, right? As something, it's exciting. But it's not. It has consequences. It's self-destructive. It tears apart the lives of those who participate. It sears the conscience, as Paul would write in 1 Timothy 4:2, and it fractures someone's identity. That guilt that you'll feel will unsettle your heart. The shame that you'll feel will reshape the mind. The adulterer will often wonder, who have I become? How did I fall this far? What happened to my integrity? No matter how you view adultery, eventually those thoughts are going to creep in because man knows that it is wrong. When you are living in sin, you cannot live with yourself. Because like it or not, acknowledge it or not, you understand that your soul has become a bondservant of sin. John 8:34. The sin corrupts that joy that once existed. The fruit might have tasted sweet at first, but soon it's just bitter. Solomon wrote in Proverbs 2, in verse 18, "For her house inclineth unto death, and her paths unto the dead." When the thrill fades, right? When the excitement of the moment is over, only misery is going to follow. Throughout Scripture, sin is never confined to one person, though. Yes, it destroys the lives of those who are participating, but it spreads, it wounds, and it destroys. And the people who suffer most are often those who did not sin at all. God's law here, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," it doesn't just protect those who would commit adultery. God's law protects the spouses. It shields husbands and wives from betrayal, from the kind of betrayal that will leave lifelong scars. Fidelity is not just a private virtue. It's a safeguard. The adulterer is the one who, according to Proverbs 2 and verse 17, forsakes the friend of her youth and forgetteth the covenant of her God. Not just a partner, but a friend. God created that marital bond to be a refuge of trust. And when that refuge is violated, it devastates those who pretended or who depended rather on it. When it is violated, how can you trust anything if you cannot trust the person closest to you? It destroys the life of the spouse. God protects them from humiliation. God protects wives from abandonment. He protects families from collapse. It wasn't, when he said do not commit adultery, he wasn't trying to restrict you. He wasn't trying to hurt your fun. He's trying to protect you. God's law also protects children. When marriage is shattered by adultery, the children are often the ones who bleed the most. Their world is torn in half by an act that they didn't commit. God's heart cries out for the vulnerable. Psalm 68 and verse 5, he is a father to the fatherless. Matthew 19 and verse 4, Christ says, suffer the little children to come to me. God loves those who are vulnerable. God defends those who cannot defend themselves. He builds barriers around them. This commandment exists in part because God refuses to allow families to be ripped apart by a single act of unfaithfulness. When God forbids adultery, he is protecting the smallest hearts in the home. God reveals the character of his faithfulness in this commandment. Every commandment that is given is a reflection on the character of the one who gave it. God forbids adultery not only because it harms the adulterer, not only because it harms others, the innocent around them, but because such betrayal, the betrayal of stabbing the one closest to you in the back, the betrayal of choosing to walk away from those who are supposed to mean the most to you, is utterly contrary to who he is. God is perfectly and eternally and unchangingly faithful. Because God is faithful, he calls his people to reflect his faithfulness. When God commands faithfulness, when he commands us to be faithful, he's not just asking us to do something with which he is unfamiliar. He's asking us to do something that he himself has perfectly displayed over and over again. Nowhere, I think, is God's faithfulness more on display than in the book of Hosea. In Hosea, there is this vivid, this painful, but also beautiful picture. God chose Hosea's life to be a living sermon, to be an illustration of something far greater, a divine dramatization of what faithfulness is supposed to look like, even in the face of betrayal. Hosea is a story that you don't just read it. When you read Hosea, you feel that story. You feel the pain of Hosea, of God. God commands Hosea to take a prostitute as his wife. Now, it wasn't a reflection on who he was as a person, but it was a reflection on Israel. God asked Hosea to live out in the flesh and blood the heartbreak that God himself experienced constantly throughout history. Gomer would break his heart and would leave for other men, just as Israel had broken God's heart and had left for idols. And yet Hosea remained faithful, just as God remained faithful. Hosea remained in that covenant despite the betrayal. Gomer left her house. She pursued sin. She pursued her other lovers. Hosea's marriage was that demonstration of how faithful God is to his people, even when they turn away. Where human faithfulness would break, God's faithfulness remains. right? When we inevitably get to Matthew 19, we'll look at marriage, divorce, and remarriage, and the allowance that God makes, because he understands that the pain of that betrayal is something that is difficult to overcome. But when he tells us to stay faithful, he's saying, look at me, I've stayed faithful even when no one else would. Even when the people that I care about most are constantly leaving me, are constantly spitting in my face, turning away, and yet I have remained faithful. All I'm asking is that you do the same. God's command to remain faithful is not something that is foreign to him. God might not take a spouse like we might, but he understands better than anyone what faithfulness costs. He has experienced heartbreak far beyond anything that we will ever experience, and yet still he has chosen faithfulness. Then we move on to the spirit of the law. Verse 28, "But I say unto you that everyone that looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart." Lust is adultery conceived in the heart. The Pharisees believed that purity was something that was purely external. They treated sin like a weed that only mattered when it broke the surface. But Jesus says sin is a root. And God judges that root just as surely as he does the fruit. He's not redefining what adultery is. He's defining where the battlefield begins. Lust is not harmless. It's not victimless. It is not insignificant. Lust is adultery that has been conceived and planted and nourished and incubated in the heart. Jesus takes that sin very seriously because God takes the heart seriously. The heart is the true battleground of holiness. Just like we saw with anger last week, it is from the heart that all the issues of life proceed. Proverbs 4 and verse 23. And not some of the issues, not most of the issues, all of them come from the heart. The heart is the fountainhead of every thought, of every desire, of every action of man. A pure heart leads to pure conduct, but a corrupted heart inevitably leads to corrupted conduct. Mark 7, 21 through 23. The outward act is simply the final expression of the inward corruption that has been growing and festering within someone. Something important that needs to be recognized, though, is that Jesus is not saying that he's not equating temptation with sin. He's not saying that if you're driving down the road and there's an attractive person walking on the side of the road and you do a double take real quick and then you've sinned. Now you've messed up. You're going to hell now. That's not what he's saying. Every fleeting thought, every uninvited image, every moment of choice, these aren't all condemned by Christ. That's where grace comes in. The sin begins when that desire takes root. He isn't talking about a glance, he's talking about a gaze. He's not talking about a moment, he's talking about the meditation. He's not talking about the sight, he's talking about the intent. When you see that attractive person driving down the road and then you go home and you think about that attractive woman or that attractive man. And you think about, wow, what would life be like to be with that person? That is when the sin has taken root. It's not just the glance. Our world is filled with corruption. It would be impossible for you to go through life without seeing something corrupt in your day-to-day life. But dwelling on that, when you choose that is when the sin begins. Lust is that desire that is deliberately entertained. James, in James 1, beginning in verse 14, traces that birth cycle of sin. He says, "But each man is tempted when he is drawn away by his own lust and enticed. Then the lust, when it hath conceived, beareth sin. And the sin, when it is full grown, bringeth forth death." That sin begins in corruption. I like the wording that he uses there, when he is drawn away of his own lust. He was on that path, on the straight and narrow. But something caught his eye over here, and he was drawn away from the path. He stepped off, and then that sin began to fester. Jesus is identifying that moment of conception, the inward act where the person chooses to dwell on or to imagine or to desire what God has forbidden. Lust is the heart committing what the body may not. Lust imagines what morality forbids. Lust manufactures scenarios in your mind. It indulges in fantasies. It crosses boundaries mentally that someone might never cross physically. In God's eyes, that moral breach has already occurred. The outward act is simply lust that has matured. Lust is the first step in adultery. It's not external opportunity. People deceive themselves. They say, well, I would never actually do it. You've probably heard the phrase of window shopping, right? Well, I'm just looking. I'm not touching. It's just a thought. It's not really hurting anyone. But Jesus declares that lust is preparation for adultery. It's adultery already beginning to grow. It's not just harmless imagination. It is that inward infidelity. It is the heart whispering yes to what God has said no. Previously in one of our sermons in the Beatitudes, we looked at what Jesus said about those who are citizens of the kingdom, Matthew 5 and verse 8. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Now, does that sound like someone who's entertaining thoughts of lust about someone not their spouse? Purity isn't just abstaining from the actions. Purity is cultivating a heart that seeks holiness. Psalm 24, 3-4. Lust is dangerous also because it dehumanizes another person. The Lord's words do more than just condemn inward sin. They reveal something about the nature of our lust that our culture likes to deny, that our culture refuses to acknowledge. Lust doesn't just corrupt the one who feels it, it dehumanizes the one who is targeted by it. Lust strips away dignity. It reduces a person to a collection of parts. It reduces a soul to an object. Lust transforms an image bearer into a fantasy. When Christ is condemning lust here, he is not only protecting the purity of the heart, he is protecting the worth of another person. The world says that lust is natural. It's harmless, or even empowering sometimes. But Jesus shows us it's dehumanizing, it's destructive. It is dishonoring of God, the very person who made us in his own image. Scripture teaches us that very fact, Genesis 1:27, that each of us were made in the image of God. To lust after someone is to treat God's image like merchandise. It is to degrade God's divine imprint on another person. James said in James 3 and verse 9, he condemns using the tongue to curse others made after the likeness of God. If we're condemned for demeaning someone with our words, how much more with our thoughts? If God condemns that, there is no way that he would not condemn that lust after a person made in his image. A person is so much more than an object. They are a lifetime of experiences, a soul who is destined for eternity, a mind that was designed for God, a spirit that was redeemed by an infinite cost. Lust ignores all of that, though, and sees only the flesh. It is a betrayal not only of the purity, it is a betrayal of the value that God places on each human life. Samson in Judges 14-16 is a case study of the danger of lust. In 14 verses 1-C, he saw a woman and she pleased him well. He wanted her simply because she was attractive. Samson was able to tear apart a lion with his bare hands but he wasn't able to control his own desires. He slept with a harlot in Judges 16 and verse 1. He eventually fell into Delilah's trap because he valued pleasure, that momentary pleasure, over purity. Samson reduced every woman to just a momentary thrill. And he never viewed these women as sisters in Israel. He never viewed them as image bearers of God. He saw what he wanted and nothing more. His downfall wasn't a single moment of weakness. It was a lifestyle of objectification. His story is proof that lust never sees a person. It sees an opportunity. But that person that you're looking at is someone's daughter or son, someone's sister or brother, someone's friend. That person may very well be a beloved child of God. But lust tears down those boundaries, those sacred boundaries that were created by God. Paul told us in 1 Timothy 5, verses 1 through 2, to treat one another, to treat other Christians like family. And that shows us that purity is part of our perspective. And when you see someone as a sister or a mother, you're not going to objectify them. That perspective is what protects dignity. Lust compromises one's inner life. Before lust destroys the outer life, before it begins to ruin relationships, before it begins to corrupt actions, it first corrodes the inner person. It first destroys what only God can see. The greatest spiritual battles are won where they are lost in the invisible places of the heart, long before they become visible. Lust is a spiritual cancer that weakens and distracts, that darkens the inner life long before it ever manifests outwardly. The inner life depends upon clarity of conscience, upon clarity of mind, upon clarity of purpose. But lust disrupts all of that. Lust makes it hard to think about spiritual things. Mark 6, beginning in verse 22, the lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. But if thine eye be evil, thy whole body shall be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in thee be darkness, how great is the darkness. The eye is the way that the mind perceives, what it pays attention to, what it contemplates, what it desires. An evil eye is a heart drawn toward those sinful desires. And the result is darkness. It's that spiritual fog. It's that confusion. Lust fogs the sight, the spiritual sight, because it is a heart that is preoccupied, too preoccupied to focus on God. Lust distracts the mind from what is holy. Paul told the Colossians in Colossians 3 and verse 2 to set their minds on things that are above, not on things that are on the earth. The problem is that lust sets one's eyes downward. Lust chooses to focus on what is earthly. It fixes its attention on what inflames the flesh rather than what nourishes the soul. It weakens one's discernment as well. The author of Hebrews tells us in Hebrews 5 and verse 14 that maturity comes from that ability to discern between good and evil. But lust dulls those instincts. It makes sin feel less dangerous. Once again, going back to Samson, he's a clear example. A man who was empowered by God, who was powerful, who was supposed to fight for Israel, and yet he was blinded by desire. He was too blinded to see the truth. A lot of times we might listen to that story of Samson and Delilah and think, how can you be so stupid, Samson? I mean, 3 times she tries to get you. Clearly you can tell, right? But he was blinded. He wasn't paying attention to the spiritual. A distorted inner life leads to terrible decisions. Lust pollutes the imagination. The imagination is one of the greatest gifts that God has given us. It's a part of what sets us apart from the rest of God's creation. It's the ability to create like the one who created us. It allows us to meditate on Scripture. It allows us to envision righteousness and to desire holiness. But lust hijacks that imagination and fills it with corruption. From the beginning, the inward imagination of sin has been condemned, Genesis 6 and verse 5. Sin begins in the imagination long before it appeared in society. When imagination becomes polluted, the inner life collapses. A polluted imagination cannot produce holy living, because as he thinketh within himself, so he is. Again, Proverbs 23 and verse 7. Lust weakens the will. It makes that resistance harder. It doesn't just tempt us, it conditions us. It trains us to surrender quickly. It trains us to erode our self-control. When you are already constantly entertaining the thought in your mind, then the action, when the opportunity arises, becomes just that much easier. Then we move on to the fulfillment of the law. Verse 29, "And if thy right eye causeth thee to stumble, pluck it out, and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not thy whole body be cast into hell. And if thy right hand causeth thee to stumble, cut it off, and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not thy whole body go to hell." Christ calls us to radical purification. He's exposed that true nature of lust. He's taken the sin out of the shadows. He's shown that it's not just that external behavior. He's brought it into the light of the heart. But once he has revealed that danger, that heart-level danger, he gives this command that honestly shocks people still today. These are some of the most severe words he spoke. He doesn't couch his words in gentle metaphor. He doesn't treat this like it's a minor flaw. He doesn't soften sin's danger. And he doesn't command just a small improvement. Not just a mild adjustment, it is that radical purification, that drastic change in one's life that begins with a realistic view of sin. Jesus' command doesn't make any sense unless we understand the seriousness of that sin. He uses that language to shock us awake to the danger that sin poses. It's not just a small inconvenience, it is a deadly threat, Romans 6:23. Sin kills, and it doesn't just kill joy, it doesn't just kill purity or relationships, it kills the soul. By using that imagery, that tearing out of the eye, that cutting off of the hand, Jesus is saying, treat sin as more dangerous than losing a limb. Sin needs to be dealt with decisively. Paul told the Colossians in Colossians 3 and verse 5, to put to death, therefore, your members which are upon the earth. What were those members? Fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. The imagery is extreme because the danger is extreme. Jesus isn't advocating for literal mutilation here. He is advocating for decisive spiritual action. We cannot give sin a foothold. We cannot give temptation a corner or impurity an open door. We cannot give place to the devil, Ephesians 4:27. That radical purification requires the removing of the source of temptation. Jesus mentions two body parts, the eye and the hand. The eye representing what we look at. The psalmist wrote in Psalm 101 and verse 3, "I will set no wicked thing before mine eyes." David understood the connection between the eye and the heart. The eye that influences the desire, that shapes your imagination, that directs your thoughts. If your eye feeds lust, then remove the source of that temptation. What that means practically, maybe it means removing some kind of media from our life. Maybe it means filtering technology. Maybe it means avoiding a certain place or changing an environment. Maybe it means drawing firm boundaries that you on what you allow before your eyes. We don't do that because the world approves of it. We do it because that's what Christ demands. And it might make the world look on you like, oh wow, what a prude, So these people are so stuck up. But it doesn't matter what the world thinks, because that's what Christ has commanded. The right hand, what we reach for or do. Again, David said in Psalm 24, beginning in verse 3, "Who shall ascend into the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in his holy place? He that hath clean hands and a pure heart, who hath not lifted up his soul into falsehood, and hath not sworn deceitfully." And that purification needs to affect both the heart as well as the habit. The hand that symbolizes the pattern of life that makes sin easier. Jesus says, if your routines, if your habits, if your behaviors lead you to sin, cut them off. Change them, get rid of them, remove them. But he understands this might not be easy. The kingdom demands costly choices. The Christian life is not something that is navigated by convenience. Holiness is not something that is maintained by comfort. Purity is not preserved without sacrifice. Jesus uses these stark words in order to prove a very simple point. If something threatens your soul, it has to go, no matter the cost. Because the kingdom is worth more than your habits. It is worth more than your comforts. It is worth more than your preferences. It is worth more than your eyes or your hands. It is worth more than anything you might be tempted to keep. Jesus uses that word profitable for a reason. He isn't saying easy, he's saying worth it. Not all profit is pleasure. The world might define profit as comfort, as ease, as that pleasure. But Jesus defines profit as anything that saves the soul. The Hebrews author in Hebrews 12 and verse 11 says, "All chastening seemeth for the present to be not joyous, but grievous. Yet afterward it yieldeth peaceable fruit unto them that have been exercised thereby, even the fruit of righteousness." Grievous now, but glorious later. There are righteous choices that hurt, but they hurt to heal. There are holy decisions that cost, but save. Some losses are temporary, but for the purpose of gaining an eternal reward. Philippians 3, 7 through 8. Paul is a wonderful example of that. Paul lost his status. He lost his comfort. He lost his reputation. He probably lost family along the way. And certainly a much more comfortable future that he had for himself. But in all of that, he gained Christ. Loss for the kingdom is never ultimate loss. Loss for the kingdom is always profitable because it gets us an eternity with God. That true righteousness, that true purity, that requires a total surrender. This text right here is all about fully yielding to God. Yielding our will, bowing completely to His authority, placing our lives totally in His hands. And Jesus isn't calling here for partial obedience. He's not asking us to be selectively pure in certain areas of our life. He's not asking for that surface level reform. He's calling for a total surrender. The kind that holds nothing back. The kind that is willing to sacrifice anything that endangers the soul. The kind that bows entirely to the rule of Christ. God has never accepted partial obedience. Saul is a really good example of that in 1 Samuel 15, right? When he was sent God commanded him to utterly destroy Amalek. And Saul obeyed, mostly. He spared the king. He kept the best of the animals. And he justified all of that in religious language, right? Well, we kept these animals for you, God. But Samuel confronted him in 1 Samuel 15:22 and said, "To obey is better than sacrifice." And then he would add in verse 23, "Because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath rejected thee." Saul called it partial obedience, but God called it full rebellion. Jesus said in Matthew 22:37, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all your heart." Not much of it, not most of it, all of it. True righteousness, true purity comes from a heart that has wholly surrendered to God. The only question that remains then tonight is, have you fully surrendered to Christ? Have you given him everything? Is there a habit? Is there something in your life that you're holding back? Now is the time to make that right. If perhaps you've just been struggling, sometimes it's hard in this life. We understand that. We're all human. We're here to encourage, to comfort, to lift you up in prayer so that God can help you through those trials of life. If this evening you have any need, we would love for you to come as we stand and as we sing.